said, there's a sense in which as we move into Prince Caspian today, I want to use Lewis's voice even more than mine. But this is Restaurant Week in Norfolk. And to prepare for Restaurant Week, I think one of the lenses I want to give you as you go through Narnia is to look at food and drink. If you remember, in the first encounter that Lucy has with the faun in Narnia, she is invited to tea with a slightly boiled egg, sardines on toast, then buttered toast, then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. Lewis dealt quite a bit with food. Remember, during the war, American women would send them hams over. So they would have all of these hams at their house that they would share with other women at Magdalen College. There are bad foods, which are addictions, like the Turkish delight. There are things that we eat and digest that we know we shouldn't. But there are so many good foods he talks about. And remember the hospitality meal at the Beaver's house. They go visit Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and this is probably one of the best portraits of an old married couple that you will see in literature. They bicker, they jump on each other, they don't listen to one another. They are wonderful. Entering their humble home, the children discover that the kettle is singing and the potatoes are boiling, and there is a string of onions, newly caught freshwater trout, a jug of creamy milk for the children, and Mr. Beaver gets his beer. This is Lewis speaking through the beaver. And a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, great and gloriously sticky marmalade roll steaming hot from the oven. When they realize that Edmund is going to betray them, they have to run out, but what does Mrs. Beaver want to do? She wants to prepare some ham and tea and bread for their escape. A very practical woman for a trip. Then, when we come to Prince Caspian, we enter, and we recognize that only Edmund and Peter remember to bring their lunches. What they find in Narnia are apples. Apples and apple trees, this kind of recurring theme and motif. Anything connected with an apple is good. An apple a day is good. Lewis loved his apples. We also find that the dwarf Trumpkin finds a good rainbow pavender fish. And then they have food like cold chicken, slices of venison, bread, apple, a good little flask of good wine, and they all pack it together. And finally, when Narnia is liberated, what does everyone shout? Refreshments. Let's eat. Food. It's time for food. It's like a fraternity at UVA. And you find that the Bulgy Bears are really some comic characters throughout because they're always hungry. Even before a war council, they want to get some honey. Who does that remind you of? Winnie the Pooh. Okay, so Lewis is kind of connecting all of these people there. Lewis gets carried away at the last dance of liberation too here, where, let me just read, you have sides of roasted meat that fill the grove with delicious smells. You have wheaten cakes and oaten cakes, honey and many colored sugars and cream as thick as porridge and as smooth as still water. You have peaches, nectarines, pomegranates, pears, grapes, strawberries, raspberries, pyramids and cataracts of fruit. Then in great wooden cups and bowls wreathed with ivy come the wines, the dark, thick red ones and the clear white ones, yellow wines and green wines, and yellowy green and greenish yellow. You could see that Lewis and his friends Tolkien like to drink, and he kind of sneaks and embeds all of these menus in there. But Lewis gets carried away. When the tree people come out, he even wants to give food for them. And so what does he give the tree people? Loam. But not regular earth and loam, but chocolate flavored. And so he's playing with food. And so I would encourage you, as you go through and read, recognize how Lewis is using food. Now, last week we talked about the origin of the fairy tales, and this week I want to talk just briefly about the defense of fairy tales. For Lewis and Chesterton and MacDonald and Tolkien, fairy tales are not responsible for producing fear in children. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of evil or what is ugly. That is in the child already, because it is in the world already. Fairy tales do not give a child his first idea of a boogeyman. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea that a boogeyman can be defeated. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he has had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for is for a St. George to kill the dragon. And so here he says, your children are not going to be afraid of burglars. It's better for them to be afraid of something that is gigantic like a dragon, because you realize there's going to be someone who does rescue them and kills it. Now, Prince Caspian is one of the most convoluted of all the stories. It's like Lewis just rushed through this one. It has intersecting parts. It's oddly structured. There are basically 4 different stories. The first one is the 4 children are brought back into Narnia from the railway station. The second is the education of Prince Caspian, who is off in the castle of Miraz. The third is the final battle between Miraz and Caspian. And then fourth is the liberation of Narnia. Now, as we begin, the 4 children are sitting at a train station when suddenly they are whisked back into Narnia by magic, by the blowing of Susan's horn. Notice how Lewis turns our expectations of magic upside down. He explores not how magic calls one, but not how one might call a genie by rubbing a lamp, but he says, what happens if you take the perspective of the genie? What happens if you're the one called into something else rather than the one who calls someone to help you? And so the children are like the genies of Narnia. They are called by this magic horn. And for Lewis, this is the mystery of our own vocation. Vocation, as you know, comes from the Latin meaning called, to be called, vocare. And so it's a calling, that all of us have a special calling. And so Lewis wants the children to know that they are called for a purpose. And this is something he tries to teach our children, that there is a purpose for every one of our children, and their whole life is to find out what that calling is. And if there is a calling, there is someone who calls. So they come back into the story, into a forest, the ruins of a castle now overgrown with leaves and vegetation, and they discover it to be their Narnian castle, the Cair Paravel. And they have returned centuries later. Now, Lewis was fascinated with time, too, the idea of space and time. And remember, this is the time of Einstein, and Einstein talks about the relativity of time, of how it kind of expands. The nature of time in Narnia is different. One day as is 1,000 years. A lifetime in Narnia is only seconds in Oxford. Of course, 30 minutes sitting here may seem like an eternity to you, but this is the relativity of time to play with. Now, Edmund has read Robinson Crusoe, and when you are shipwrecked, the first thing you should do is look for fresh water. It's the same thing that happens in Hunger Games. When Jennifer Lawrence gets there and her friends realize in this controlled space island of the games, they must first find water. And so Lewis is giving all of these kind of practical things. They wander around and they begin to recognize everything they've seen there. And they repeatedly ask one question. They ask, do you remember? Now, this is one of the most important questions that we can ask in our church. Do you remember? It is good and biblical to ask that question. Think of Passover. What do they ask at Passover? Why is this night so special? You begin to teach your children by asking questions rather than giving them answers. And so it's the whole process of teaching people to ask questions. Do you remember the times that you have laughed? Do you remember the times of your marriage, of your wedding, of your honeymoon? Can you remember the good times when you sat with friends? It is important to relive these times and to record them. This whole idea of the memory of tradition leads us not only back in Scripture, but our own Christian lives, our own pilgrimages. And Lewis likes things that are old. When they go back, they find old Narnians. They find old kings and queens. Old is good. Modern is not good. Lewis does not like progress. He likes things that are old. And if we look around, we can see some very good things among us. Old things, okay. Now, they also remember the battles and what Aslan has done, similarly to the discovery of the law in Ezra and Nehemiah. And then they remember. Now, the other thing, too, we look at are the autobiographical and literary allusions in this. One of the first characters we meet is a dwarf named Trumpkin. He explains the whole situation to Caspian. He says Caspian was raised by his uncle, Lord Miraz. Now, this has shadows of Hamlet. If you remember in Hamlet, Hamlet's uncle kind of usurped the throne and destroyed his father. And so Lewis is kind of touching a lot of Shakespeare even in this book here. And so Miraz has sent the friends of Caspian away, the 7 noble lords that we will meet next week on Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And Miraz and his wife, Queen Pruna Prisma, were about to have their own child. Caspian's fortune doesn't look very good anymore. Now, I love this woman, Pruna Prismia. Pruna Prismia is Lewis's way to play with both Charles Dickens and Oscar Wilde. In Little Dorrit, Dickens has a character whose name is Pruna Prisma, and she has these alliterative explanations, and she says things like prunes and prisms. And so these kind of alliteration phrases come through. Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest, introduces the governess, Mrs. Prism and Mrs. Prizzle. But the idea of prunes was something that Lewis detested. He said it gave him a certain distaste and it gave him an affinity with children. Once in a hotel dining room, Lewis said rather too loudly, "I loathe prunes." "So do I," came an unexpected 6-year-old voice from another table. Sympathy, he said, was instantaneous. Neither of us thought it funny. We both knew that prunes were far too nasty to be funny. Now, simultaneous to the children coming into Narnia, we have the initiation tale of Caspian. He is going to be forced out of this castle where he sleeps on silken sheets and eats from gold and silver dishes into a bachelorhood. He is going to have to grow up. Lewis also takes a swipe at modern education, particularly some of his colleagues at Oxford here. And it's one of these kind of bits that he throws out for adults as well. Caspian's one lesson comes from a book, and the book is called The Grammatical Garden, or The Arbor of Accident Pleasantly Open to Tender Wits. Now, it has that kind of medieval name, but where Lewis plays with us is the author. The author's name is Pulver Lentus Siccus. Pulver Lentus Siccus. If you divide it, you kind of do it etymology. Pulver means basically dust. Lentus, slow. Siccus, dry. This is slow, dry, dull reading. This is what we force children to read. It's very much, when I was growing up, we had to memorize all the capitals of all the states, and we had to know all the exports. And Lewis says, no, that is not what is going to stay with you. What is going to stay with you are the stories that we give one another. He has also this other autobiographical moment that we mentioned last week, where the person who teaches him fairy tales is his nurse, his nanny. She is the one that tells him these old Irish tales. And it goes back to Whitman's idea that the hand that rocks the cradle is the one that's going to determine the future. The stories that a mother and a father tell their children and grandparents tell their children is going to shape them. So he gets the nurses fired by Miraz, and he gets another instructor who is Dr. Cornelius. And Cornelius, as we remember, was the centurion in the book of Acts. Did you know that February the 4th, coming up, is a liturgical calendar day for Cornelius in the Episcopal Church? And so we're going to be celebrating this little Cornelius on the 4th he comes up. But he's kind of half dwarf, half human. You don't know what he is. He's hooded. And he creates in Lewis the sense of the numinous. Now, the numinous is this kind of haunting darkness, this mystery of life that all of us may have tasted at one time or another when you realize there is more out there. There are more things in your world, Horatio, than are ever dreamed of. There are things that haunt us, and we sometimes wake up during that hour of the wolf between 3 and 4 in the morning, and the numinous kind of overcomes us. And Lewis is preparing people for a mystery that is beyond our normal experience. But the children come in, Caspian is prepared to leave by Cornelius, and he goes back and he meets the Narnian, and they blow the whole horn. Then, as he gets with the Narnians, they get together and they're getting ready to fight Miraz. There is a book called The Planet Narnia by Michael Ward from Oxford. And what he does, he identifies every Narnian book with a planet. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe was Earth. This planet is Mars for Prince Caspian, because there are 2 influences of the planet Mars. One is the military, 2 is the sylvan, or the woods. The woods and the military, the battles and things. And so they come together in this whole book, where you've got bows and shields and swords like a middle-aged knight. You have soldiers and enemies and captains and sentries and scouts. And the distant ancestor of Caspian is called the Conqueror. Lucy mentions the War of the Roses, and the children remember battles. And so this whole spirit of Mars is over there. And where do they come to fight? But at the Birnam Woods. The Birnam Woods where the trees come to life. And it's something we'll get to later on. And you remember in Macbeth, what is it that's going to destroy him? It's the trees of Dunsamar that are coming up against him. And so Lewis is kind of making a reference there as well. But I want to deal with three themes really briefly: fear, faith, and freedom. Lewis teaches children and us about the nature and different kinds of fear. Some kinds of fear, he says, are very good. He confessed to certain fears. The two things he feared most of all were insects. He said, I would rather meet a ghost than a tarantula any day. Secondly, he had a fear of vertigo, of high places. And these two things we thought were healthy fears. There are good fears and bad fears. Fear of public speaking was never one of his fears. According to kind of American stats, that's the fear that all of our students have more than anything else, being called up to speak there. King Miraz and his Telemarines are afraid of the sea and the forests of trees. Even though they don't believe in talking trees, they don't want to go into the woods. And they have heard of Aslan, but they don't believe of him, and so they become these superstitious fears for them. Now, fear can be determined by our preconceptions, and so when they are afraid of these things, they will not be open to meeting them. They're thoroughly terrified when they actually meet Aslan, because though they knew about lions, they had not really believed in them, and this made their fear greater. And Lewis describes their fear in just a really graphic way. Their cheeks became the color of cold gravy. Their knees knocked, and many fell on their faces. There is a real fear in seeing the tree people when they're there. Now, when the evil dwarf Nickabrick mentions the name of the White Witch to Caspian and Cornelius and Trufflehunter, they shudder. He says, don't take fright of that name as if we were children. But the name of the White Witch, however, is something that should strike an honest fear. It should strike caution. There is an ordinate and proper response to be wary of things that might harm you. And Lewis implies that such a healthy fear is good. And we find that Rowling picked this up, and what did she call Voldemort? He who should not be named. Okay, it's that fear of the name. But then we contrast it to the child of the old woman's cottage, who was not afraid of Aslan, even though he had never seen a lion before. All he knew were kittens. And here was this very large kitten, and so there was no fear when he encountered him. When Aslan comes to Susan, he counsels her, don't listen to your fears. If she does, her faith cannot come to the fore. When Susan listened to her fears, Aslan calls her up, and he says, come, let me breathe on you. Forget them. Such a ministry of the Holy Spirit to come upon people and all of us when we have our fears, that we need God to breathe into us and breathe upon us. Fears that follow and taunt and haunt us, we need to have that breath of God that comes. Fear is first, but the way to get rid of fear is through faith. The people of Narnia had lost their faith and their sense of tradition, much like the Episcopal Church. I'm kidding, okay. I'm Episcopal, I can say that. I had a problem the last year with Bishop Shorey, who went down to South America, and if you remember, she gave a talk on Philippians, and she was talking about the woman, the little girl that Paul exorcised the demon from, the python spirit. And she said he shouldn't have done that because that shows kind of a kind of ethnic bias against this kind of God that is there, because it's all one. And I thought, we've forgotten the tradition, and sometimes we distort it, even those of us who are leaders. And we are kind of most in danger of that. But here we have faith that comes and tries to restore us. Now look at the different levels of faith we have in the characters here. First, there's denial. Miraz and his people just do not believe that there is anything like Aslan. King Edmund, bah. They don't believe, and they just shut it off. What is interesting is that a new book has come out by Peter Williams over from Oxford on C.S. Lewis and the New Atheists. And he basically shows that what has happened with the New Atheism, have taken ideas from Ingersoll and from Huxley and others and just reworked them. And Lewis, even though he wrote 50 years ago, is still kind of speaking to many of the questions that are raised. And so you have this wonderful debate that goes on between the faith and between atheism. Then there is, besides this denial, there is a disbelief in the good, a very pragmatic kind of faith. And this is Knickerbrick. Knickerbrick's faith does not lead to secularism or materialism, but to the occult and to sorcery. "Do you believe in Aslan?" said Caspian to Knickerbrick. "I'll believe in anything or anyone that will batter those cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything. Aslan or the White Witch, do you understand?" I think as we look at kind of Islamic terrorism today, we say anything will do to get rid of them. No, it doesn't. We do not deny who we are, our character, our virtue, to kind of even deal with things that we see are wrong. And Lewis is kind of preparing us for that. How do we deal with the evil? Do we kind of bring in other evil to fight evil? And he says, no, this is not the kind of Christian way to do it. "I'll believe in anything or anyone," he says, "the White Witch, hag, ogres, or werewolves." The third area is doubt. And Frederick Buechner, the great Presbyterian writer, says, doubt he calls the ants in the pants of faith. We need ants in our pants. We need doubt. Doubt is a very good thing that all of us go through. And here you have Trumpkin the Red Dwarf. You have Truffle Hunter the Badger, who is settled, solid in his faith, sensible, loyal. Those are the ones you want working in the church day by day. They're so faithful. But you also need the Trumpkins. Trumpkin does not really believe in Aslan and doesn't believe the children are there. And the whole story of Trumpkin and his conversion approximates Lewis's own reluctant conversion. Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, talks about how stubbornly he came to the kingdom of God. He didn't want to meet God. He didn't want to believe in God, but he comes in. And what does Aslan do when he finally shows himself to Trumpkin? He throws him up in the air like a pillow, and he tosses him around, and he just makes him just enjoy God. And I think God comes into many people's lives in a way that's so sudden but so wonderful. And we're always looking for kind of a solemn entering. Joy, who was C.S. Lewis's wife later on in life, was talking about how one day she was going about her business and she felt God was trying to speak to her. And so she kind of ignored him as much as she could. And finally she knew it was probably some sin she had to confess, something else that was out there that was bothering God. And so she said, "Okay, what?" And he said, "I just want you to know I love you. I want you to relax. I want you to taste my joy." And so Joy began to say, we are so afraid of what God is going to come in our lives, but he comes in to give us good. He comes in to give us his delight. And remember our confession every Sunday. The one thing we forget in the confession at the end is after we've confessed our miserable sins, it says we are going to what? Delight in his will. Delight is a word we have forgotten. How many of us can say we're really delighting in what God has given us? We're enjoying it. We're laughing. That's where Dorothy Sayers has this wonderful story where this wicked woman comes up to the confession and the communion, the Eucharist. She receives the Eucharist, and she comes back to her chair just laughing hilariously. And everyone else is offended, but she has had her sins forgiven. And she's recognized it, and she is full of joy. So here we have the kind of faith of the children. Lucy is the one who sees Aslan first. And he says, she says, will others see you? Certainly not at first, says Aslan, but later on it depends. But they won't believe me, said Lucy. It doesn't matter, said Aslan. You follow me. And she follows him down a cliff at the edge of a gorge through the tough times. George MacDonald wrote a little story that influenced Lewis called The Princess and Curdie. And the princess and her good friend Curdie are really close, and they're afraid of goblins. But there is an old woman, and whenever you find an old woman in a MacDonald story, she's God. Okay? There's an old woman, she's God. There she is. And the woman gives her this invisible thread and said, you need to follow this thread wherever it will take you. And so she begins to kind of follow the thread one day, and it keeps going closer and closer to the kingdom of the goblins. And she finally gets to this kind of cave with rocks all over it. And she goes in, and she doesn't know why. That thread has brought her to this most dangerous place, and all the cumbersome stuff that is there that she has to get rid of, these obstacles. And she begins to take the rocks off by one and discovers Curdie has been buried alive. And if she had not followed the thread through the tough times and the stones, he would not have been rescued. So we wonder what we are going through, and yet there is kind of this will, this providence of God that is there. The other thing that happens to Lucy is that when she looks at him, she goes, Aslan, you're bigger. And he says, that's because you've grown older. Now notice the paradox of this. Aslan seems to have grown. And usually as we grow older, things of the past look smaller. We go back to old homes. They're not as large. Usually the things of the past look smaller, to return to those old places, to old rooms, to old teachers, to old clothes, to wedding gowns. Somehow they're smaller. No, they're bigger. But Aslan gets bigger as we look at him. Finally, we have the faith that everyone who believes will ultimately see. And it leads us to freedom. Freedom invites celebration. And this is the end of the book. It's wild. Remember when Ezra and Nehemiah brought forth the book of the law, and the people, when they heard the law read after so many years of this drought, they wept. But their leader said, no, 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 no. Do not mourn or weep, but go your way. Eat the fat, drink the sweet wine, and send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. So the people went their way to eat and drink and rejoice greatly and became Episcopalians. They partied to the Lord. There's a sense in which we are called again to enjoy. When he goes through this, all of a sudden, Narnia comes alive. And Aslan becomes this kind of glad creator of nature. He's over all of nature. And it's very bacchanalian. It's kind of like this game of tag that goes on there. In fact, we have Silenus, we talked about last week, that drunken old fat man who is there on his donkey. And he is following Bacchus. Bacchus rides a donkey, and he is this kind of beautiful young boy, a faun, with vine leaves wreathed around him, curly hair. His face is wild and almost too pretty for a boy, says Lewis. But he's there, and he's bringing all of this celebration. And they do somersaults, and they're kind of ecstasy all over the place. And they're crying out like cheerleaders, one, way, which is a word for joy. They're saying joy, joy, joy. And so Lewis is using these mythological figures to bring in the joy of the kingdom of God. That we have lost this wonderful sense of the earth that is there. Now, what is interesting, too, he also recognizes, as Bruno Bettelheim does. Bruno Bettelheim, in his book, The Use of Enchantment, says that fairy tales help children mature. And here we find that who is afraid of Bacchus and all of this celebration but Susan? And Susan is 13 years old. And she said, I wouldn't have felt very safe with Bacchus and all of his wild girls if we had met them without Aslan. I should think not, said Lucy. What has happened is that Susan is going through puberty, and there is a whole sense of her body becoming something amazing and fearful and wonderful and scary. And so this part of Greek mythology kind of touches into that, and Lewis says, this is a natural thing. This is something that's going to happen, but when you have Aslan, everything will be taken care of. Even the bridge is kind of destroyed over the river god and everything there. Everyone becomes what they were meant to be. Boys become pigs. Aslan accelerates the process. All of a sudden, you see what's happening. And I close with this one kind of great story by George MacDonald. And again, it's the story from Curdie and the Princess. Curdie has this power to take someone's hand and to recognize what that person is becoming. Okay? Let me see if I can do this. See if I have the gift of Purdy. Give me your hand. Swan. Ooh. A doe. An eagle. Oh, good. A lion. A toad. A weasel. A lawyer. Okay. But there is a gift you have, but it's just there. But Lewis says, essentially, when God comes, he will make you more of what you are. He has designed, he has called you to be something, and through this whole process, we do not yet know completely what it is we were meant to be. Now I close with the very last story, which is kind of a parable of providence. And it seems that there was a very wealthy man down in Florida who invited a whole group of Episcopalians down, and he said, I want to show you everything I have. He showed the antique automobiles, the gems, priceless paintings. But he says, the one thing I value more than anything else is out here in the back. And it was an Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with alligators. And he said, if any of you will jump in this pool and swim across, I'll give you whatever you want. Everyone kind of backed away from the pool. But suddenly there was one young man, in the pool. He was moving across fast. His arms were splashing in the water. Alligator jaw snapping his heels. He was moving so fast. He got to the other side. He was drenched. And the billionaire came out and said, "That was incredible. That was amazing. What do you want?" He says, "I want to know who pushed me in." Okay. In our lives, we want to know who pushed us in. This is the question of all of life, and this is the question of Caspian. Who pushed me into this world to be made a king? I don't feel I could be a king. Who pushed me into this world to make me what I am? And that's why we come to Narnia and to church. And now we go to Norfolk State and we hear the rest of the music of the festival. Thanks.